Margaret had always believed that retirement would feel like freedom. After 40 years of working as a nurse dealing with night shifts, emergencies, and the constant pressure of caring for others, she thought she'd finally get to rest. But retirement turned out to be different from what she'd imagined. It wasn't the relaxing paradise everyone talked about. It was quiet. Sometimes too quiet. She lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city. The building was old with creaky floors and walls thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing. But it was home. She'd moved there after her husband passed away 10 years ago, when the house they'd shared became too big and too full of memories. The apartment was just right for one person. A bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living room with a window, and a balcony barely big enough for a few potted plants. Margaret's days followed the same rhythm. She'd wake up early even though she didn't have to anymore. Old habits from decades of morning shifts died hard. She'd make herself tea, water her plants on the balcony, and watch the city wake up below her. Then she'd go for a walk if the weather was good. Twice a week, she volunteered at the community center, helping organize activities for other seniors. It gave her something to do, a reason to get dressed and leave the apartment. Money was tight. Her pension covered rent and basic bills, but there wasn't much left over. She'd learned to shop carefully, buying whatever was on sale, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. She'd stopped going to the movies. Eating out was a luxury she couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed. Sometimes she had to choose between buying her medicine or buying something nice. The medicine always won, but it hurt to make that choice. On this particular Tuesday, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. Margaret had gone to the grocery store early, hoping to beat the storm. She'd managed to find some good deals on vegetables and a carton of orange juice that was about to expire. The store marked it down and she grabbed it quickly. Every little saving mattered. By the time she left the store, the rain had started. Not a gentle drizzle, but the kind of rain that soaks you in seconds. She hurried to the bus stop, her plastic grocery bags cutting into her fingers. The bus stop had a small shelter, and she wasn't the only one taking cover. A few other people stood there shaking off their umbrellas, staring at their phones, lost in their own worlds. That's when Margaret noticed him. A man, maybe in his 50s, leaning against the back wall of the shelter. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the kind you see on TV or in magazines. Dark gray, perfectly tailored, probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. His tie was loosened, hanging crooked around his neck. His briefcase lay open on the ground beside him, papers scattered and getting wet from the rain blowing in. But it wasn't his clothes that caught Margaret's attention. It was his face, pale, sweating, his hand pressed against the wall like he needed it to stay upright. His eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. Margaret had seen that look before, hundreds of times. 40 years as a nurse taught you to recognize when something was seriously wrong. While everyone else at the bus stop ignored him, probably thinking he was drunk or on something, Margaret knew better. She set down her grocery bags and walked over to him. Her knees weren't what they used to be, but she knelt down anyway, right there on the wet concrete. Up close, she could see his lips had a slight blue tint. His breathing was shallow. Definitely not drunk. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. The way she'd spoken to thousands of patients over the years. The man's eyes shifted slightly toward her, but he didn't really seem to see her. He mumbled something she couldn't understand. Margaret gently took his wrist, feeling for his pulse. Fast. Too fast. She looked at his face again, the sweat, the confusion, the trembling in his hands. She'd bet everything she owned that this was a diabetic emergency. Low blood sugar. He needed glucose, and he needed it now. "Do you have diabetes?" she asked him directly. He nodded weakly. Or maybe his head just dropped. It was hard to tell. "Do you have anything with you? Glucose tablets, candy?" He tried to gesture toward his briefcase, but his arm barely moved. Margaret quickly searched through it. No glucose tablets, no candy. Just papers, a laptop, and expensive pen business cards. Nothing that would help. She glanced around the bus stop. The other people were deliberately looking away now, uncomfortable with the situation. Nobody wanted to get involved. That's how people were these days. Everyone in their own bubble, pretending not to see when someone needed help. Fine. Margaret would handle it herself. She always did. She grabbed her grocery bags and dug through them until she found the orange juice she'd just bought. She twisted off the cap and held it up to the man's lips. "I need you to drink this," she said firmly. "Small sips. Can you do that for me?" He tried to push it away, confused, but Margaret was persistent. She'd dealt with confused patients before. "I'm a nurse. Trust me, drink." Something in her tone must have gotten through to him because he let her tip the container, and he swallowed a small amount. Then another sip. And another. Margaret watched his face carefully, looking for signs of improvement. It took a few minutes. Minutes where Margaret knelt there on the wet ground, her knees aching, rain soaking through her coat, holding the juice for this stranger. Slowly, very slowly, color started returning to his face. His eyes began to focus. His breathing steadied. "There you are," Margaret said softly, the way she used to talk to patients waking up from surgery. "You're okay? You're going to be okay." The man blinked several times, looking around like he wasn't sure where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then his eyes landed on Margaret, and something like recognition crossed his face. Not recognition of her, but recognition of what had just happened. What?" he started, his voice rough. "You had a hypoglycemic episode," Margaret explained, sitting back on her heels. "Low blood sugar. Do you normally have diabetes?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I had meetings all morning. I forgot to eat. Forgot my insulin timing." He looked embarrassed now, like a kid caught skipping homework. "It happens," Margaret said, though her nurse instincts wanted to scold him for being careless with his health. "But you need to be more careful. This could have been much more serious." The man looked down at the orange juice container in Margaret's hand, then at her grocery bags, then back at her. "That was yours. Your groceries." "It's just juice," Margaret said with a small smile. "You needed it more than I did." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wallet. An expensive leather wallet, the kind that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. "Please let me pay you back. For the juice. For helping." "No." Margaret cut him off gently but firmly. "I don't want your money. But I was a nurse for 40 years, she said, slowly getting to her feet. Her knees cracked in protest. "This is what we do. We help people. That's all." The man stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. He wasn't used to people refusing his money, she could tell. He pulled out his phone, his fingers still slightly shaky. "At least let me call you a cab." "You're soaked." "The bus will be here soon," Margaret said. "I'll be fine. Please," he insisted. "My driver. He can be here in 5 minutes." "It's the least I can do." Margaret was about to refuse again when she saw the look in his eyes. He needed to do something for her. Needed to feel less helpless, less like someone who'd just been saved by a stranger at a bus stop. She understood that feeling. "All right," she agreed. "Thank you." While they waited for his car, the man introduced himself. David Rothstein. He was the CEO of some pharmaceutical company Margaret had probably heard of but couldn't remember. He handed her his business card, insisted she take his number, asked for her name. "Margaret Chen," she told him simply. When his sleek black car pulled up, Margaret helped him gather his scattered papers and put them back in his briefcase. David thanked her 3 more times before getting in the car. Through the window, she could see him still looking at her, like he was trying to memorize her face. Then the car drove away, and Margaret was alone at the bus stop again with her grocery bags, minus 1 container of orange juice. The rain was still falling. Her bus pulled up a minute later. As Margaret rode home, watching the city blur past through the rain-streaked windows, she didn't think much about what had just happened. It was just another Tuesday, just another person who needed help. That's what you did when someone needed help. You helped them. She had no idea that this ordinary moment would change everything. 3 weeks passed and life went back to normal. Margaret had almost forgotten about the man at the bus stop. Almost. Sometimes when she poured herself orange juice, she'd remember his pale face and shaking hands. She wondered if he was taking better care of himself now. Probably not. Rich people never thought anything bad could happen to them until it did. She continued her routine. Morning tea. Watering plants. Walks when the weather was nice. Volunteering at the community center. The same comforting pattern day after day. It was peaceful, even if it was a bit lonely. At 68, Margaret had made peace with lonely. Then everything fell apart on a Thursday morning. Margaret was making breakfast when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Heavy footsteps, official sounding. Then came the knock. Not a friendly neighbor knock. A business knock. The kind that meant trouble. She opened the door to find her building manager, Mr. Harrison, standing there with a clipboard and an uncomfortable expression. He wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said, and she could hear the apology already forming in his voice. "I have something I need to give you. All the tenants are getting one." He handed her an envelope. Thick paper. Official letterhead. The words "Notice to Vacate" printed across the top in bold letters. Margaret's hand started shaking as she read. The building had been sold. New owners. Plans to renovate and convert to luxury apartments. All current tenants had 60 days to move out. 60 days. 2 months to find a new place to live, pack up her life, and start over. "I'm sorry," Mr. Harrison said. And he actually did look sorry. "I just found out yesterday. The sale went through fast. They're paying us to leave early, but the tenants, they said 60 days is standard notice." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She closed the door slowly and stood there in her tiny apartment, the notice still in her hand. Around her, everything looked the same. Her couch where she drank her morning tea, her small TV, the pictures on the wall, her husband's watch in a frame on the shelf. All of it would have to go somewhere else. But where? She sat down and forced herself to read the entire notice carefully. There was no mistake, no loophole. 60 days and then she'd be homeless. The next morning, Margaret bought a newspaper and started circling apartment listings. Her budget was tight, incredibly tight. She could afford maybe $500 a month for rent, and that was pushing it. Every listing she called had the same story. Too expensive. Already rented. No pets, no seniors, no exceptions. Do you have good credit? One landlord asked. Do you have references? Asked another. Can you pay first and last month plus security deposit? That was the question that hurt most. Margaret barely had enough saved for 1 month's rent, let alone 3 months up front. She tried to stay positive. Tried to tell herself something would work out. But every day that passed, every rejection made it harder to believe. Her daughter Rachel called one evening. She lived 2 states away with her husband and 3 kids. Margaret almost didn't answer, but Rachel was persistent. "Mom, you sound tired. Everything okay?" Margaret wanted to lie. Wanted to say everything was fine. But she was so tired of carrying everything alone. So she told Rachel about the eviction notice. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Rachel said the words Margaret had been dreading. "Mom, I wish I could help." "I really do. But we barely have room for the 5 of us. And Tom just found out his hours are getting cut at work." "I know, sweetie," Margaret said quickly. "I wasn't asking. I just wanted you to know what's happening. Maybe you could look into senior housing. Those assisted living places?" Margaret had already looked. The waiting lists were years long. The places that had openings cost twice what she could afford. She'd spent 40 years taking care of other people, and now when she needed help, there was nowhere to turn. After hanging up with Rachel, Margaret sat on her couch and cried. Really cried. The kind of crying she hadn't done since her husband died. The kind that came from somewhere deep and scared and exhausted. She'd been strong for so long. Strong through her husband's illness. Strong through the funeral. Strong through every lonely day since. But this felt like too much. The weeks crawled by. Margaret packed a few boxes, but it felt pointless when she didn't know where she was packing them to go. She started sorting through her belongings, deciding what she could afford to keep and what she'd have to sell or throw away. Every item felt like losing a piece of herself. Her husband's favorite coffee mug. The quilt her mother had made. Books she'd been meaning to read. The plants on her balcony that she'd carefully grown for years. How do you pack up a life? How do you decide what matters when everything matters? She stopped sleeping well. Would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, doing math in her head. If she cut back on groceries even more, could she afford a slightly more expensive apartment? If she stopped buying her blood pressure medication, would she have enough for a deposit? But she knew that was crazy. She needed her medication. She'd seen too many patients put off their health until it was too late. One afternoon at the community center, one of the other volunteers noticed Margaret looked upset. Betty, a woman about her age who always wore bright scarves and had opinions about everything. "You look like you lost your best friend," Betty said, sitting down next to Margaret in the break room. Margaret found herself telling the whole story. The eviction, the impossible apartment hunt, the fear of ending up with nowhere to go. Betty listened and shook her head. "It's criminal what they're doing to people like us. We worked our whole lives, paid our taxes, raised our families. And this is what we get? Pushed out so some developer can make more money? I don't know what to do, Margaret admitted. It felt strange to say it out loud. She'd always been the one with answers, with solutions. Now she had nothing. You could try calling social services, Betty suggested. They have programs sometimes. Emergency housing assistance. Margaret nodded, but she'd already called. The programs were underfunded, overloaded, and the woman on the phone had basically said not to count on help unless she was literally on the street. Come back when you're actually homeless, the woman had said, as if that was helpful advice. With 2 weeks left before she had to be out, Margaret was packing up her kitchen when she came across the orange juice she'd bought to replace the one she'd given to that businessman at the bus stop. David. That was his name. She'd thought about him occasionally over the past few weeks, usually when she was feeling particularly sorry for herself. Must be nice, she'd think, to have money, to have a driver and expensive suits and not have to worry about choosing between medicine and food, to never have to count pennies or check price tags or stress about rent. Must be nice to live in a completely different world. But then she'd remember how scared he'd looked that day. How helpless. Money couldn't save you from everything. It couldn't save you from your own body turning against you. She'd seen plenty of rich patients in the hospital over the years. Money bought better rooms and private nurses, but it didn't make you less sick, didn't make you less human. Still, she couldn't help the small, bitter thought that crossed her mind. She'd saved his life, and here she was about to lose her home. Life wasn't fair. She'd always known that, but knowing it didn't make it easier to accept. Margaret continued packing. She'd found a storage unit she could barely afford for her furniture. A friend from the community center had offered to let her stay on her couch for a little while, just until she found something permanent. It was charity, and Margaret hated accepting charity, but what choice did she have? She sorted through her closet, pulling out clothes she hadn't worn in years. Did she really need to keep all this? She found her old nursing uniforms in the back, the ones she'd worn for decades. White, practical, a little yellowed with age. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away. They represented who she was, who she'd been. The person who helped people, the person who mattered. Now she felt like she didn't matter at all. Just another old woman in the way of progress. Just another person society had decided wasn't worth the trouble. The day before she was supposed to be out, Margaret sat in her nearly empty apartment, surrounded by boxes and garbage bags. Most of her furniture was already in storage. Her plants were with Betty, who'd promised to take care of them. The walls looked strange with nothing hanging on them. Just pale squares where pictures used to be. She made herself tea in the only mug she hadn't packed yet and sat on the floor, her back against the wall. Tomorrow, a friend with a truck would come get her remaining boxes. Tomorrow, she'd lock this door for the last time. Tomorrow, she'd be officially homeless, staying on someone's couch at 68 years old. She thought about her husband. What would he say if he could see her now? He'd always been so proud of her work as a nurse. You're making a difference, he'd tell her after her long shifts. You're helping people. What good had it done her? She'd spent 40 years helping people, and where were they now? Nobody was lining up to help her. That wasn't fair, she knew. Her friends were helping. Rachel would help if she could. People did care. But caring didn't change the situation. Caring didn't magic up an affordable apartment or make her pension bigger. Margaret finished her tea and washed the mug, then packed it away in her last box. She'd come to this apartment after her husband died, thinking it would be temporary, a place to figure things out. 10 years later, it had become home. And now she was leaving, and she had no idea what came next. She tried to pray, something she hadn't done much since her husband's funeral. But the words wouldn't come. What was she supposed to pray for? A miracle? Those didn't happen to people like her. As the sun set through her bare windows, Margaret made a promise to herself. She wouldn't give up. She'd survived her husband's death. She'd survived 40 years of hard work and night shifts and difficult patients. She'd survived this too, somehow. But that night, lying on her air mattress in the empty apartment with everything she owned packed away in boxes, Margaret felt more alone and scared than she'd ever felt in her life. And she couldn't help but wonder if anyone in the world even noticed or cared that Margaret Chen was losing everything. Margaret woke up on Saturday, morning in her nearly empty apartment, feeling like she'd barely slept. Her back ached from the air mattress. Her head hurt from stress. Today was the day. Her friend with the truck would be here in a few hours to take her remaining boxes to storage, and then she'd go stay on Betty's couch until she figured out something more permanent. She made coffee using the last of the grounds she hadn't thrown away. No milk left, no sugar, just black coffee that tasted as bitter as she felt. She sat on the air mattress, sipping slowly, looking around at the bare walls and empty spaces. Everything important was already gone, packed away or in storage or given away. The apartment looked like a shell now, like nobody had ever lived here at all, like Margaret's 10 years here didn't matter, like she didn't matter. She'd just finished her coffee when there was a knock at the door. Margaret glanced at her watch. Too early for her friend with the truck, maybe the building manager doing a final walkthrough. She wasn't even fully moved out yet. Give her a few more hours, for heaven's sake. She opened the door, prepared to explain she'd be out by noon, and froze. Standing in her doorway was David Rothstein, the businessman from the bus stop, the one she'd helped weeks ago. He was wearing casual clothes this time, not the expensive suit. Jeans and a nice sweater. Behind him stood a young woman holding a clipboard and carrying a leather bag. Margaret was so surprised she couldn't speak for a moment. She was very aware suddenly of how she must look. Old sweatpants. Her husband's oversized t-shirt, no makeup. Her gray hair pulled back in a messy bun. Boxes stacked everywhere behind her. "Mrs. Chen," David said with a warm smile. "I hope it's not too early. What are you doing here?" It came out ruder than she meant it. She was just so confused. "Looking for you, actually. It's been quite an adventure." He laughed a little. "You never gave me your phone number or address. Do you know how many Margaret Chens there are in this city?" Margaret blinked. "You've been looking for me?" "For weeks," the woman behind him said. She had an efficient, professional look about her. "I'm Rebecca, Mr. Rothstein's assistant. We've called probably 60 Margaret Chens. We finally tracked you down through the community center," David explained. "One of the volunteers there mentioned you. May we come in? I know it looks like you're busy, but I really need to talk to you." Margaret stepped back, embarrassed by the state of her apartment but not sure what else to do. David and Rebecca came in looking around at the boxes and bare walls. "Are you moving?" David asked, concern crossing his face. "Something like that," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to cry in front of strangers. She'd done enough crying. Rebecca, with her clipboard and professional manner, seemed to pick up on something. She glanced at David, then back at Margaret. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Chen?" And just like that, Margaret's composure cracked. Maybe it was because someone was actually asking. Maybe it was because she was so tired of holding it together. Maybe it was because she had nothing left to lose. "No," she said quietly. "Everything's not all right. The building sold. I have to be out today. I don't have anywhere to go." The words hung in the air. David's expression changed from friendly to deeply concerned. He looked around the apartment again, really seeing it this time. The packed boxes, the air mattress, the garbage bags, a woman's whole life reduced to things that could be stored or thrown away. "Sit down," he said gently. "Please tell me what happened." Margaret almost laughed. "Sit where?" She didn't have furniture anymore. But she sat on her air mattress, and David sat on the floor across from her like it was perfectly normal. Rebecca remained standing, her hand on her clipboard, so Margaret told them everything. The eviction notice, the impossible apartment search, the landlords who wouldn't rent to a senior on a fixed income, the deposits she couldn't afford, her daughter who couldn't take her in, the storage unit and the friend's couch, and the complete uncertainty of what came next. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to maintain some dignity, but it was hard. This was her life falling apart, and she was explaining it to a virtual stranger who'd stumbled into it by accident. David listened without interrupting. His face got more serious as she talked. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. "I had no idea," he said finally. "Mrs. Chen, do you remember what happened at the bus stop?" "Of course. I was having a hypoglycemic episode. My blood sugar had dropped dangerously low. If you hadn't helped me, if you'd been like everyone else at that bus stop and just ignored me, I could have slipped into a diabetic coma. I could have died." "You don't know that," Margaret said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in his voice. "Yes, I do. My doctor was very clear about that when I told him what happened. You saved my life, Mrs. Chen. You used your own groceries, your own orange juice that you'd carefully budgeted for to save a complete stranger. You didn't ask who I was or if I could pay you back. You just helped." Margaret shrugged. "That's what you do when someone needs help." "No," David said firmly. "That's what you did. Most people wouldn't have. Most people didn't. There were 6 other people at that bus stop, and every single one of them pretended not to see me. You were the only one who stopped? I'm a nurse. I know what to look for." "You're a nurse who gave away your own food to help a stranger," David corrected. "And then you refused my money. Do you know how rare that is? How strange that was to me?" Margaret didn't answer. She was starting to feel uncomfortable with where this might be going. David looked at Rebecca, then back at Margaret. "I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to find you. I needed to thank you properly, to do something meaningful for the person who saved my life, and now I find you here losing your home." "It's not your problem," Margaret said quickly. "I appreciate you coming by, but I'll figure something out. I always do." "What if you didn't have to figure it out alone?" David asked. Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" David glanced at Rebecca again. They seemed to have some kind of silent communication. Rebecca nodded slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I own several properties in this city. Apartment buildings mostly. Investments my father made years ago that I inherited. One of those buildings is about 15 minutes from here, near the community center where you volunteer. There's a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor that just became available." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She knew where this was going and she didn't like it. "I can't afford anything near the community center. That area's gotten expensive. I'd like to offer it to you rent-free," David said simply. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at him. "What? Rent-free? For as long as you need it? No strings attached? No catch? No." The word came out automatically. "Absolutely not." David looked surprised. "Mrs. Chen, I don't take charity," Margaret said firmly, her pride rising up even as part of her screamed that she was being an idiot. "I've worked my whole life. I've always paid my own way. I don't need anyone's handouts." "It's not a handout," David said gently. "It's gratitude. You saved my life. I gave you orange juice," Margaret said. "That's not worth a free apartment, isn't it?" David leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, Margaret, please listen to me. That day at the bus stop, I had a wake-up call. Not just about my diabetes, but about my whole life. I'd been so busy with meetings and deals and making money that I'd forgotten to eat, forgotten my insulin, forgotten to take care of myself. I was literally killing myself for a job." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "After that day, I changed things. I hired a health coach. I set reminders for meals and medication. I even cut back my work schedule. My daughter noticed. My ex-wife noticed. My doctor definitely noticed. I'm healthier now than I've been in years, and it's because you stopped to help a stranger when nobody else would." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "That's wonderful, but nothing," David interrupted gently. "You gave me my life back, and right now you need a place to live. I have one. Why is this so hard?" "Because I don't know you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Because accepting this feels like giving up. Like admitting I can't take care of myself anymore." Rebecca, who'd been silent this whole time, spoke up. "Mrs. Chen, may I say something?" Margaret nodded. "I've worked for Mr. Rothstein for 5 years. I've seen him donate millions to charities. I've watched him fund scholarships and medical programs and community initiatives. Do you know what he tells me every single time? It's easy to write a check, that's what he says. Writing a check is easy. But you didn't write a check. You gave him something money can't buy. You gave him attention and care and your own food when you had very little to spare. That's worth more than any amount of rent." The tears Margaret had been fighting spilled over. She wiped at them angrily, frustrated with herself for breaking down in front of these people. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," David said quietly. "Please let me do this. Not because you need it, although you do, but because I need it. I need to know that the person who saved my life isn't sleeping on someone's couch. I need to know you're okay, please." Margaret looked around her empty apartment. At the boxes and the air mattress and the evidence of her life falling apart, she thought about Betty's couch and the storage unit and the complete uncertainty of what came next. She thought about her pride and her independence and all the years she'd refused help from anyone. And then she thought about how tired she was. How scared, how alone. "The apartment has a balcony?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David's face broke into a smile. "A big one. Perfect for plants." Margaret closed her eyes. This was crazy. This didn't happen to people like her. Things like this only happened in movies or books. But here it was happening. A stranger she'd helped once offering her a lifeline exactly when she needed it most. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay, yes." Rebecca smiled and made a note on her clipboard. David stood up and offered Margaret his hand to help her to her feet. "You can move in today if you want. The apartment's furnished. Everything's ready. Today?" Margaret felt dizzy suddenly. "We'll arrange movers," Rebecca said efficiently, "for your boxes and anything in storage. Mr. Rothstein, should I call the company we used last month?" "Yes, please," David said, then turned back to Margaret. "Is that all right? Too fast?" Margaret laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I was supposed to be on someone's couch tonight. So no, it's not too fast. It's perfect timing. It's—" She couldn't finish. The relief was overwhelming. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. "That's my daughter. She wanted to know if I found you. I've been telling her about the bus stop. She's thinking about becoming a nurse, actually." "Really?" Margaret felt a small warmth in her chest, pushing back some of the overwhelming emotion. "Really, she wants to help people. I told her about you, about how you didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, just saw someone who needed help and helped them. That made an impression on her." Rebecca was already on her phone, arranging things with impressive efficiency. Margaret stood in the middle of her empty apartment with David, and for the first time in weeks she felt like maybe things would be okay. Maybe life wasn't just about struggling and losing. Maybe sometimes kindness came back around. "Thank you," Margaret said, and this time she let herself cry without trying to hide it. "Thank you so much." David shook his head. "No, Mrs. Chen, thank you." 3 days later, Margaret stood in her new apartment, still unable to believe it was real. She kept waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell her there'd been a mistake, that she had to leave, but nobody came. This was hers, for as long as she needed it. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a well-maintained building. Not fancy, but solid, clean, the kind of place that felt safe. The one bedroom had big windows that let in beautiful light. The kitchen was small but had new appliances. The bathroom had a walk-in shower with grab bars, which Margaret appreciated more than she wanted to admit. And the balcony. The balcony was twice the size of her old one, with enough room for all her plants and then some. Betty had helped her bring the plants over yesterday. They'd stood on the balcony together, arranging the pots, and Betty had cried happy tears. "Good things do happen to good people," she'd said, hugging Margaret tight. "Sometimes they really do." The movers David had sent were professional and efficient. They'd brought all her boxes from the old apartment and everything from the storage unit she'd rented. Her furniture looked better here somehow. Like it fit. Like it belonged. Margaret had spent the last 2 days unpacking, finding places for things, making the space feel like home. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. On her first day in the new apartment, David had stopped by with Rebecca. He'd brought a welcome basket with fresh flowers and nice coffee and some fancy chocolates. And then he'd asked if they could talk. They'd sat at her small kitchen table and David had pulled out some papers. "Mrs. Chen, when I was tracking you down, I talked to several people who know you. At the community center, at your old building, even your former supervisor at the hospital. Everyone said the same thing. You dedicated your life to taking care of others." Margaret had felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I did my job. More than your job," David had corrected. "Your supervisor told me you used to stay late without pay to hold patients' hands when they were scared. That you'd bring food from home for patients whose families couldn't visit. That you learned Spanish and Mandarin just so you could talk to patients in their own language." Margaret shrugged. "Patients heal better when they feel cared for. It's just science." David had smiled at that. "Well, while doing my research, I found out something else. You stopped taking one of your medications last year. Your blood pressure medication." Margaret had frozen. How did he know that? "I have a friend who's a pharmacist," David explained. "I asked him to do some checking. It's expensive, that medication. About $300 a month without good insurance. You're on Medicare, but there's still a gap, so you stopped taking it to save money." "It's fine," Margaret had said quickly. "I'm managing." "You shouldn't have to manage," David had replied firmly. "Mrs. Chen, my company is a pharmaceutical manufacturer. We make several medications, including the one you need. We also run patient assistance programs for people who can't afford their prescriptions." He'd pushed the papers across the table to her. "I've enrolled you in our program. Your blood pressure medication and any other prescriptions you need will be provided at no cost. All you have to do is sign these forms and give them to your pharmacist. Margaret had stared at the papers, not sure whether to laugh or cry. You can't do this. I already did, David had said. It's a legitimate program, Mrs. Chen. We help thousands of patients every year. You qualify based on your income. This isn't charity. It's using the system the way it's supposed to be used. But there was more, always more. David hadn't been finished. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you. My company has a patient care division. We review our programs, talk to patients, try to improve how we serve people. We need consultants who understand healthcare from a patient's perspective, nurses who've been in the trenches and know what real people need. Margaret had looked at him suspiciously. What are you saying? I'm saying I'd like to offer you a part-time consulting position. Maybe 10 hours a week, completely flexible schedule. You'd review our patient programs, give us feedback, help us understand what works and what doesn't. We'd pay you $1,500 a month. Margaret had done the math instantly. $1,500 plus her pension would give her actual financial breathing room for the first time in years. She could buy groceries without counting pennies. She could replace her worn-out shoes. She could maybe even go see her daughter and grandchildren. That's too much, she'd protested weakly. It's the standard rate for consultants, Rebecca had interjected, showing her a page of numbers. Actually, it's on the lower end. But Mr. Rothstein thought part-time would be better given your age. No offense. None taken, Margaret had said, still staring at the numbers. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, David had suggested. Take your time. Get settled here first. The offer stands whenever you're ready. Now 3 days later, Margaret was still processing everything. She'd started taking her blood pressure medication again. The relief was physical. She'd been having headaches for months, dizzy spells she'd tried to ignore. Already she felt better, clearer, like fog was lifting. That afternoon there was another knock on her door. Margaret opened it to find David with a teenage girl. She was tall, with dark hair and her father's eyes. She looked nervous. Mrs. Chen, this is my daughter, Lauren, David said. She's been asking to meet you ever since I told her what happened at the bus stop. Hi, Lauren said shyly. Dad says you were a nurse for like 40 years? 42, actually, Margaret said, smiling. Would you like to come in? They sat in her living room and Lauren asked a million questions. What was it like being a nurse? What kind of patients did she work with? Was it scary? Did she ever save someone's life? Margaret answered patiently, watching the girl's enthusiasm. She reminded Margaret of herself at that age. That same desire to help, to make a difference. That same fire, I want to be a nurse, Lauren said finally. But everyone at school says I should be a doctor instead because I'm smart enough. My mom thinks I should do business like Dad. But I don't want to do those things. I want to help people directly, you know? Like you did with my dad. Margaret felt something warm in her chest. Being a nurse is one of the hardest, most important jobs in the world. Anyone who tells you different hasn't seen what nurses do. We're the ones who hold hands at 3 a.m. We're the ones who notice when something's wrong before the doctors do. We're the ones patients trust with their fears. Lauren's eyes were shining. Yes, exactly, that's what I want to do. Then do it, Margaret said firmly. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. The world needs good nurses. Before they left, Lauren hugged Margaret. Thank you, she whispered, for helping my dad, for being nice to me, for everything. After they were gone, Margaret sat on her couch and cried again. But these were different tears. Not tears of stress or fear or exhaustion. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of feeling like maybe she mattered after all. Over the next few weeks, Margaret settled into her new life. She accepted David's job offer and started reviewing patient programs. It turned out she was good at it. She could spot problems immediately, see where programs were too complicated or didn't account for real-world situations. David would send her reports, and she'd send back detailed notes. He told her she was invaluable. She got her plants thriving on her new balcony. The bigger space and better light made them happy. She'd sit out there in the mornings with her tea, watching the city below, feeling grateful. David stopped by once a month to check on her. Sometimes he brought Lauren, who was now seriously researching nursing schools. The girl would sit with Margaret for hours, listening to stories from the hospital, asking advice, absorbing everything like a sponge. Margaret loved those visits. Lauren reminded her why she'd become a nurse in the first place. But the best part was the security. Margaret didn't wake up at night anymore worrying about money. She could go to the grocery store and buy what she needed, not just what was on sale. She could call her daughter without that underlying stress of hiding how bad things were. She could breathe. One evening she was sitting on her balcony when Betty called. They talked for a while, catching up. Then Betty said something that made Margaret pause. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Betty asked. "That day you helped that man at the bus stop. You had no idea who he was. You just saw someone who needed help and you helped them. And look what happened. It's like the universe was paying attention." Margaret thought about that after they hung up. She didn't believe in cosmic justice or karma or any of that. Life had taught her that bad things happen to good people all the time. But maybe, just maybe, sometimes good things happened too. Sometimes kindness came back around. Not because you earned it or deserved it, but just because the world could be unexpectedly generous. She thought about what her life would be like right now if she'd walked past David that day at the bus stop. If she'd been like everyone else and pretended not to see him, she'd probably be sleeping on Betty's couch still, desperately searching for an affordable apartment that didn't exist. Her blood pressure would still be dangerously high. She'd still be choosing between medicine and food, but she hadn't walked past him, and that had made all the difference. A few days later, David invited Margaret to dinner at his house. It was a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood, the kind of place Margaret had only seen in magazines. His ex-wife was there too, a kind woman who thanked Margaret repeatedly for saving David's life. Lauren gave Margaret a tour of the house, showing off her room covered in posters about nursing and health care. During dinner, David raised his glass. "A toast," he said, "to Margaret Chen, who proved that one person's kindness can change everything." Margaret raised her glass too, feeling emotional. "To second chances," she added quietly. Later, as David drove her home, they talked about how strange life could be. How one rainy Tuesday at a bus stop had connected two people who had nothing in common except their humanity. How a simple act of kindness had rippled out in ways neither of them could have predicted. "I think about that day a lot," David said as they pulled up to Margaret's building. "About how close I came to real trouble. About how nobody else stopped. And then you did." "I'm glad I did," Margaret said simply. "Me too," David replied. "Me too." Margaret went up to her apartment, made herself tea, and sat on her balcony. The city lights twinkled below. Her plants rustled in the gentle breeze. She was home. Safe. Secure. Cared for. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Chen felt like everything was going to be okay. More than okay. She felt like life still had good things waiting for her. Like her story wasn't over yet. Like maybe, just maybe, the best chapters were still to come, and it all started because she'd stopped to help a stranger on a rainy day. Because she'd chosen kindness when nobody else would. Because she'd remembered what it meant to be human in a world that often forgot. Margaret smiled and sipped her tea, grateful for orange juice, for rainy days, for second chances, and for the beautiful, unpredictable way life sometimes worked out exactly when you needed it most. A year passed. Margaret stood at the community center's appreciation dinner, accepting an award for her years of volunteer service. David and Lauren sat in the front row, smiling proudly. When asked to speak, Margaret's voice trembled with emotion. "A year ago, I helped a stranger at a bus stop. He was having a medical emergency, and I did what nurses do. I helped. I didn't think much about it." She paused, looking at David. "But weeks later, when I was being evicted and had nowhere to go, that stranger came back. He'd spent weeks searching for me, and when he found me losing everything, he saved me, just like I'd saved him." Margaret's eyes swept across the room. We never know when a small act of kindness might change everything. That rainy Tuesday, I almost walked past him. I was tired, worried about my own problems. But I stopped. And that choice created a ripple effect that gave us both our lives back. She smiled through her tears. We live in a divided world, but underneath everything, we're all just people who need help sometimes, and we all have the power to be the person who stops, who sees someone struggling and chooses to care. My husband used to tell me I was making a difference. For years, I didn't believe him. But this year taught me that making a difference isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up. It's about choosing kindness over convenience. Every single time, the room erupted in applause. People stood, many wiping tears from their eyes. Later that night, Margaret sat on her balcony with tea, looking at the stars. She thought about that rainy day at the bus stop. How one split-second decision to help had changed everything. How two strangers had saved each other in the most unexpected way. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. "Mom, I saw the video of your speech. I'm so proud of you." "I love you," Margaret smiled, typing back, "I love you too. Come visit soon." She looked around her beautiful apartment, at the plants thriving on her balcony, at the life she'd rebuilt from nothing. A year ago, she'd been facing homelessness. Now she had security, purpose, and people who cared. It all started because she'd stopped to help a stranger, because she'd chosen connection over indifference, because she'd remembered what it meant to be human. Margaret thought about Lauren, now in nursing school, inspired by that rainy day. About David, healthier and more focused on what mattered. About the medication program he'd started to help other seniors like her. About all the lives touched by one moment of compassion. The ripple effect kept spreading, touching people she'd never meet. She didn't believe in fate, but she believed in connection. She believed that every person you met created possibilities, changed trajectories, mattered. Before bed, Margaret prayed, not asking for anything, just expressing gratitude. Thank you for that rainy day. Thank you for the courage to stop. Thank you for David and Lauren. Thank you for second chances. Thank you for reminding me that I still matter. She climbed into bed, falling asleep with a smile. Tomorrow she'd water her plants, work on her consulting reports, maybe call Lauren. She'd live her life with purpose and gratitude, and if she saw someone who needed help, she'd stop. She'd always stop, because that's who she was, the person who helped, the person who cared, the person who believed that in a world of strangers we were all connected by our shared humanity. Margaret had saved David's life with orange juice and nursing knowledge. David had saved Margaret's life with shelter and security. But they'd both saved each other in a deeper way. They'd reminded each other that the world still had good in it, that people still cared, that when everything seemed lost, sometimes a stranger would appear at exactly the right moment. The lesson was simple but profound. Every encounter is a chance to change someone's life. Every moment is an opportunity to choose kindness. One act of compassion can ripple out and change the world, all because one woman chose to stop on a rainy Tuesday and help a stranger who needed her. That choice changed everything.